Franz Liszt's piano etude known as Feux, follets is both hard for a Texan like me to pronounce and hard for anyone to play on the piano.
Feux, follets, arguably the most difficult of the 12 transcendental studies.
A piece that strikes fear into the hearts of all pianists.
But that didn't stop Korean pianist Yunchan Lim from performing it like few human beings ever have before in the 2022 Van Cliburn Competition. What makes this piece so hard? What makes Yunchan's performance so good? And what is any of this crazy music about in the first place? In a moment, I'm going to hand things over to a slightly younger and more attractive version of myself to explore Liszt's Feux, follets through the lens of Yunchan Lim's miraculous performance. This is part of a series of Yunchan commentary videos I've recorded after the Cliburn that are slowly making their way to the light of day. With that in mind, let's turn to Yunchan's performance. We'll pick things up at the final climax of Mazeppa, just moments before Yunchan begins Feux, follets. Now, after surviving a near-death experience, you'd think that a pianist deserves a bit of a break. But no. For the few pianists mad enough to actually play all 12 of these things in a row in concert, when you finish the fourth etude, Mazeppa, you're only a third of the way through the set, and only about a quarter of the total time that it takes to play all 12.
Sitting in front of the instrument and finishing something like Mazeppa, and then facing Feux, follets, and dispatching it like that as if it's nothing, is absolutely extraordinary.
Every time I hear Feux, follets' scintillating opening run, I can't help but think of the very first video I ever watched on YouTube. I was 19 years old and at the peak of my piano obsession. I spent my summer in the piano world forums arguing about which Rock 3 was the greatest and trying to order the Chopin etudes in terms of difficulty, when all of a sudden I clicked innocently on a link. You have to remember that this was the age of VHS and DVDs. This is how I got my piano fix when I was Yunchan's age. Gould, Horowitz, Brendel, Horowitz, Gould. I had pretty narrow tastes back then. And the idea of streaming video on the internet was still a rarity. So whereas teenage piano dorks like me in the mid-2000s had very limited access to videos of the greatest pianists, Yunchan and his generation of pianists grew up with YouTube, and many of them learned from watching videos of pianists online. Not only was this the first YouTube video I'd ever seen, it was the first time I'd ever heard Feux, follets. That looks so impossible, I don't even want to get close to the score. Feux, follets begins with this diminished scale pattern, a kind of rainbow that goes up and eventually comes down. I do think Kissin has one of the best openings to it, and Yunchan's is pretty dope too. Notice that it's actually the left hand which is controlling and steering the phrase.
This passage, it symbolizes, let's say, just a harmonical cloud on top of beautiful melody in the left hand. And the target really was to achieve this basically like light speed.
When you look up Feux, follets, you'll see that it translates as will-o-wisp, a kind of ghostly light witnessed throughout history in remote locations, often over marshes and swampland, and ascribed supernatural significance. Now, in European folklore, will-o-wisps have been considered sinister spirits who are trying to disorient you and lead you astray. And in literature, they're often likened to goals that are impossible to reach, yet you follow out of some delusion, like trying to learn Feux, follets. So what will-o-wisp was Liszt thinking of when he composed his fifth transcendental etude? Well, I went down a rabbit hole to try to figure it out, and when I came back out, I'm convinced now that this faux follet is actually the one that appears in Goethe's Faust. In it, Mephistopheles summons a faux follet and orders it to lead he and Faust up the mountain on Walpurgis night in order to party with a bunch of witches. Goethe's Faust was basically Liszt's favorite book when he was a young man, ever since Berlioz introduced it to him in the early 1830s, just a few years before Liszt would develop the etude that would eventually be dubbed Feux follet. So I don't think it's far-fetched to hear the opening of Feux follet as the devil bickering with a will-o-wisp. So once we get to the first theme and double notes, Mephistopheles and Faust are on their way up the mountain with the will-o-wisp. Now those of you who know Feux follet know that what I'm calling the main theme is actually the passage that makes a lot of people think this is the hardest etude of the whole set.
Feux follet, will-o-wisp, arguably the most difficult of the 12 transcendental studies.
So what exactly makes it so hard?
It's a question of having a free and independent fourth finger.
Well, you can see that it's what pianists call a double note passage. In this case, a rapid run with alternating fourths and fifths and thirds.
I think in every double note passage, it is very important to be able to practice separately.
Of course, I remember practicing it just the top voice sometimes for a while until I really knew my fingering.
And play the upper notes legato and the lower notes staccato. And just do that straight through.
I remember many hours of just practicing dotted. It's very hard to play dotted, and then sometimes I would practice it. I would almost accent the dotted note.
Now the other thing I do with this is I alternate the accent. Instead of I do.
Because it challenges your mind, it kind of tricks your mind to think more intensely about what I'm omitting, what I'm not omitting. So that refines each gesture.
What's really remarkable about Yunchan's double notes is just how clear his line is, and you can really hear it when comparing to other pianists. Taking Holodenko's cue, with such demanding etude passage work in the right hand, sometimes the best course is to focus on making music with the left. And we can actually gain an insight from looking at the score to the first version of this piece that Liszt wrote when he was about 15. Here we can really peer into Liszt's compositional process. Now I mentioned that Czerny was Liszt's piano teacher, but Liszt of course was also a prolific composer, and he had a composition teacher. It was none other than Antonio Salieri. Yes, that Salieri. And no, he didn't kill Mozart.
Grazie, signore.
Now Salieri, at this point in his 70s, taught Liszt composition in keeping with the traditions of the 18th century. And that meant basically two things. On the one hand, solfeggio, the development of one's ear through sight singing practice, and on the other hand, what Salieri called figured bass. Now what he means by figured bass is not simply a continuo accompaniment to some chamber piece, but actually partimento. Partimenti were bass lines that served as exercises for music students to learn how to improvise and ultimately gain the framework and knowledge to write compositions. And here in Liszt's little innocent proto-faux follet, you can actually see a kind of partimento bass line that you could assign figures to.
So this simple bass line in B flat would have been realized classically as and that's exactly how Liszt realizes that bass line in both his teenage and mature versions of the etude. The only difference between the two is how he styles the surface, and it happens to be quite a big difference. Liszt's first version sounds a bit like Schubert, who was alive and well and living in Vienna at the same time as Liszt. A decade or so later, and it's as if faux follet went through puberty, and now Liszt styles the bass line with these fluttery double note chords. So just to drive this point home and have a little bit of fun, I'm going to try to play Liszt's first version while Yunchan plays the final version. Can't keep up with this kid.
I bring this up because it's relevant to the performer. The true virtuoso is sensitive to the fundamental structure of a composition. This gives a mental and physical framework for executing all the filigree on the surface and imbuing it with stylish phrasing. And this is exactly what I hear in Yunchan's own performance. Now, as we continue up the mountain, returning to Faust, this left hand starts to get kind of funky. I think the boys are nearing that rager that the witches are throwing. Walpurgis Night is actually still celebrated in Germany on the night of April 30th. Lots of people dress up as witches. And in Yunchan's performance, I think you really hear the witches dance. Now, notice how Yunchan starts to bring out that syncopated rhythm a little bit more. The jump in the left hand and fun grace note that he has to catch at the top. Now, as much bounce as Yunchan's performance has, I have to pay homage to some other performances of the work. Some pianists really like to show this syncopation, and in doing so, I think bring out the almost comical spookiness of this scene. And probably my favorite instance of this is György Cziffra in a live recording of Feux follet. It's absolutely hilarious here. Okay, that's enough of that. I'm really hearing the witches flying around on their broomsticks and laughing like mad here. It's getting kind of crazy in here. While some pianists like to lean into the really eerie, mysterious side of Feux follet, others like Cziffra really make a farce out of it. What I like about Yunchan's is it really splits the difference between the two, and you get on the one hand a kind of spooky humor, but on the other, a really chilling ghostliness. Now, in the latter half of the work, there's this sneaky moment that prompts another really difficult double note phrase. Yunchan seems not only utterly at ease, but he's having fun. Just watch his face right here. Wait for it.
I was noticing during his Feux, follets, the fifth of the Transcendental Etudes, which is a piece that strikes fear into the hearts of all pianists. He had a big smile on his face during a lot of it. It was actually fun for him to play.
I think he was enjoying everything. I mean, it looked like he was enjoying the instrument. It looked like he was enjoying just being in the music.
But what's coming up is maybe the most insane part of the whole piece. And at this point, the chat just blows up. For all intents and purposes, the competition is over. Returning to Yevgeny Kissin now, at the end of Feux, follets, you really can hear that he favors these sort of cartoonish ghosts. Yunchan plays with a little more subtle, sinister humor. The piece ends more or less how it began. The will-o-wisp has had its fun. Mephistopheles is back to helping Faust make really terrible decisions with his life. And then we move to the sixth etude of the set, Vision, which depicts a kind of funeral procession. A funeral for the pianist who never made it out of Mazeppa or Feux, follets alive.